May all beings be happy. May all beings be healthy. May all beings be free from harm. May all beings love life. May all beings awaken. Welcome to another Cuke audio podcast. I'm DC Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Pandita and Feline Cuchita and dear lovely Katrinka. I pray that you and yours are safe and comfortable and free of economic hardships and able to get out and do what you want within the confines of the universal precept to do as little harm as possible. So today we have chapter 17 of Crooked Cucumber, One and Many. We're rounding the bend toward the finish with comments. And there's a lot of comments. And they begin at 1 hour, 27 minutes, and 49 seconds. So it'll begin right after pause to meditate. So when you hear the bell, if you wish, hit pause and meditate, or don't meditate, or whatever you call it, for as long as you wish. And when you're through, hit unpause, and we'll hit the bell to end meditation, and we will all have meditated together. Another bell will ring, the deep Aheji bell from 1959. And after that, there will be chapter 17 of Crooked Cucumber. Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki, Chapter 17, One and Many, 1969 through 1970. Our purpose of our practice is to enjoy our old age. But we can't fool ourselves. Only sincere practice will work. One day at Tassahara, in late April of 1969, after the spring practice period was over and just before the guest season was to begin, Shunryu Suzuki walked downstream with some students to eat bag lunches and enjoy the water in the hot afternoon. Tosahara Creek was fairly high, and they had to cross it in one place over a fallen sycamore trunk. They hopped on stones across the little stream feeding into the creek at the base of the trail to the horse pasture. Then they came to a water-worn granite passage called the Narrows. There they sat on stream-polished ledges near the gushing water and ate their cheese sandwiches, cookies, and apples, reaching down to get handfuls of the creek water. Once the guest season started, the smooth, sloping rock sides and pools would usually be adorned with a half-dozen naked bodies. There was a rule for students only against skinny dipping at the Narrows, which most students ignored unless in larger mixed groups. That day, everyone had on swimsuits or shorts. After eating, everyone but Suzuki jumped in the cold mountain water. He watched them freely sliding over the waterfall into the deep pool. Dan Welsh went down the wet, sloping face next to the waterfall in full lotus, and others followed. Suzuki saw some good places to sit on the opposite bank in the direct sun and decided to go there via the deep pool where his students were enjoying themselves. He entered the water. The current was fast. It carried him into the whirlpool bowl and quickly down the falls into the deep water. Then he kept going down, straight down. He couldn't swim. He reached his arms out, but no one noticed or thought anything of it as he went under. He thought to walk out, but couldn't touch bottom. He found himself at the clear bottom with the crayfish and trout. He looked up at the legs moving in the water. They were too far away to grab. He became frightened and started to take in water. Up top, someone asked, "Where's Roshi?" They quickly fished Suzuki out, coughing up water and gasping. Suzuki recovered and walked back upstream the mile to Tassahara. In his lecture that evening, he mentioned what had happened and said that not being able to breathe had shown him how deeply he was attached to life and air. It had made him realize how poor his practice and understanding were. He had to be more sincere and diligent in his efforts to concentrate on the great matter. A few weeks after he almost drowned, on his 65th birthday, in a lecture at Sokoji, Suzuki appealed to his students to join him in a rededication to sincere practice. He said he was, on one hand, happy to be getting older, but on the other hand, regretful of the shortcomings of his past practice. Maybe it would be better for everyone, he said, if he went off to seek truth. He had mentioned at times, almost wistfully, that he'd like to go to India, Thailand, and Burma. Wherever he heard there was someone who could give him instruction. He said that he felt a great responsibility as a teacher and was always thinking about what to do with so many students. While in bed recovering from a cold, he had thought about these things and decided it might be better for us to concentrate on a simpler practice. I think the most simple practice is counting the breath. Whatever their problems in Zazen, pain, confusion, sleepiness, frightening or seductive images, the students were to join Suzuki in counting their exhalations from 1 to 10 over and over. We need more of a beginner's practice, he said, and he admonished, If you count your breathing, you will easily notice when you are not taking care of your everyday life. I have many difficulties in my practice, so I think you too will find it very difficult to sit in good zazen. Enlightenment is not a complete remedy. Oksan came down to Tassahara from San Francisco. She stayed in a one-room cabin with tatami and shoji screens next to her husband's. There she practiced tea ceremony. Suzuki talked about her in a lecture. He said she was always trying to teach him not to be so introverted and thoughtless with her. He used the American phrase, "can't live with her, can't live without her." During the spring practice period, Suzuki had declared in a lecture that Oksan had experienced some sort of breakthrough. Some students took this to mean that she'd attained permanent, perfect cosmic consciousness, and others thought it meant she'd had an epiphany. Really, he said, she got enlightened. I never thought it would happen, and he kept laughing and explaining. He said that her enlightenment came about because she couldn't find a priest to do a funeral for a member of the Sokoji congregation. Suzuki was always having to leave Tassahara to do funerals. Many members wanted him for their funeral, even if another priest was available. This is the most important thing that Zen priests do as far as Japanese lay people are concerned. On his way from Tassahara to Sokoji, Suzuki asked the student driving him, Jane Runk, to make numerous stops. She didn't know he had to do a funeral, and he had forgotten all about it. They went to the beach, to shops, and had an unusually carefree time. Meanwhile, Oksan was frantically searching for another priest. Katagiri was at Los Altos. Kobun was in Japan. Her sense of responsibility was strong, and she practically had a nervous breakdown. Then she realized that the world would keep turning if there were no priest. In an instant, she gave up, let it go, decided just to do her best. Bang! Something happened. Suzuki knew that when he talked too much about enlightenment, people tended to get fixed ideas about what the word meant and get obsessed with it as a goal. Students would sometimes talk about it, but there was no agreed-upon definition. Most thought of Suzuki as enlightened, but he wouldn't say he was. If asked, he would usually deny it. But whatever he had, his students wanted to have it too. Whatever he knew, they wanted to know. Some, like Claude, said Suzuki wasn't enlightened and had clearly said so through the years. Mike Dixon said he obviously was, pointing out that in earlier years, Suzuki would occasionally start a story by locating it, for instance, after his second enlightenment experience. But mostly, such talk was avoided. Suzuki did not promote enlightenment as a final resting place. Some students didn't think they were going to get enlightened with Suzuki, or felt they couldn't have enough contact with him, and went to study with other teachers, Yasutani, Nakagawa, the Rinzai master Sasaki in L.A., Maizumi in L.A., Kaplo in Rochester, Aitken in Hawaii. All those teachers used koans as well as zazen, saw students frequently for private interviews, and were clearly encouraging people to have kensho, or enlightenment experiences. Often people wouldn't get to see Suzuki for Doksan more than once a year. At Yasutani's sessions, there would be public recognition of students who attained Kensho. Zen centers seemed to be short on enlightenment, indeed, a little sleepy compared to the other teachers with their vigorous styles. Suzuki didn't talk about enlightenment as something that could be controlled. He said that most priests weren't enlightened, and some lay people were. He spoke of a farmer near Rinsoin who was enlightened, even though he'd never been a practicing Buddhist. Of his students, he once said that maybe only 1 in 10 would get enlightened, but that it wasn't really necessary. To do the practice was itself enlightenment, even if people didn't realize it. Things did happen to his students, though. Ken Sawyer, a carpenter from Canada, had been at Zen Center for a couple of years. During a session in San Francisco, while sitting in afternoon zazen, he dissolved into an amazing spaciousness. He kept it to himself at the time, but later told Suzuki of his experience in Doksan at Tassahara. Yes, you could call that enlightenment, Suzuki said. They sat there for a moment in Suzuki's cabin, facing each other. And how's your work coming? Later that summer at Tosahara, Ken was carrying incense for Suzuki on the way to Zazen. Suzuki crossed the bridge, and Ken followed with the green incense held high, trailing a pleasant thin wisp of smoke behind him. Suzuki went to the edge of the bridge and stood looking at the creek below. Periodically, the echoing sound of the mallet on the wooden board would pierce the air, the third and final round. While Suzuki looked down at the creek, Ken saw him disappear, blending totally with the water, wood, and air. A moment later, they were walking down the dirt and cobble path and toward the zendo. Ken didn't know what had happened, or if it had happened to him, to Suzuki, or both. But he had learned one thing. Suzuki's way was not to latch on to the highs, but to accept every moment of life as it comes, step after step. So he walked on and made nothing of it. If you are enlightened, the whole universe tells the truth to the whole universe. If your practice doesn't include every one of us, it is not true practice. Bombers were pounding Hanoi. 4 students at Kent State had died protesting Nixon's invasion of Cambodia. The first nuclear-tipped MIRVs were placed in underground silos. It was the year of the first Earth Day. Reagan was running for his second term as governor of California, and Salvador Allende was running for president of Chile. Alexander Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Patton won the Oscar for Best Film. Bertrand Russell died. At Tassahara in May of 1970, all this news seemed remote. Tatsugami Roshi, who had kept Jean, Graham, and Philip under his wing at Eiheiji, had come to lead the spring practice period at Tassahara. He was back in Japan for the summer, but was scheduled to return to lead the fall practice period. While Tatsugami was at Tassahara, Suzuki had been concentrating on Page Street. But now he was back in his briar patch. Now the last of the winter's heavy snowfall was melting away on the ridge. In the year when the Pope declared priestly celibacy to be a fundamental teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, Suzuki acknowledged the success of women and men practicing together at Tassahara. Most students were single, but there were some married couples, a few unmarried couples, and lots of children. Buddhism had hardly ever seen anything like it. The disparate group of former students of Asian culture, long hairs and individualistic seekers who had gathered around Suzuki, had managed to get along and get on with the practice and study of Zen with far greater cooperation than had seemed possible at the outset. Suzuki was no longer calling Tosahara a baby monastery. From May 1st till after Labor Day weekend in September, Tassahara's tradition of welcoming guests continued. The guests were enthusiastic about the quiet and efficient way the place was run, and were full of praise for the food. There had been less meat and fish served each summer, and by the following year the guest fare was totally vegetarian, due to Tatsugami's insistence that it was improper to serve meat or fish in a Buddhist monastery. He said that the guests would understand. He was right. The food just got better. Tatsugami, as well as Katagiri, had told the men who weren't monks not to shave their heads, just to cut it short. As a result, they looked a little more normal to the guests. Because during the practice period, Tatsugami had spent so much time teaching chanting and ceremony, there was a great deal of catch-up work to do on the buildings during the guest season. While most students took care of the guests, a crew of carpenters was finishing the ambitious stone and beam kitchen and the adjoining entryway and library. Suzuki's cabin was moved to make way for the stone foundation for a new, more substantial cabin for the abbot. The crew had to interrupt their work briefly when they discovered that Suzuki and Mel, exhausted from moving stones, were taking a cat nap on the cabin floor when it started to move. That summer, a segment of a film on gurus called Sunseed was shot at Tosahara, and Suzuki played with a yo-yo for the camera. Charlotte Selver and Charles Brooks held another sensory awareness workshop in the dining room. A psychotherapist and naturalist named Sterling Bennell gave a talk about the geological history of the land and said that Tassahara was a meeting place of 3 major California ecological zones. Robert Bly read his poetry. Suzuki frequently gave lectures in the evening. Eager students on cushions squeezed up front on the tatami and on the time-darkened linoleum aisles. There was a brief chant at the prompt of a small bell, then a pause that would magnify the sounds of the creek, frogs, crickets, and guests walking by the road. He was lecturing on the Sando Kai, the unity of one and many, a 1,000-year-old Zen poem that Tatsugami had included in the morning service. In this and other ways, Suzuki was giving his blessing to the new forms that Tatsugami had instituted and was giving them more life and relevance as well. He had attended years of lectures by Kishizawa on the Sando Kai. Now he was undertaking to shed some light on the scripture. He would use the phrase, things as they are, or things as it is, depending on whether he was speaking from the viewpoint of multiplicity or oneness, form or emptiness. Usually, though, we say to observe things as they are, or more accurately, as it is. Actually, we are not observing things as they are because we think, here is my friend, there is the mountain, there is the moon. That is a dualistic way of observing things, not actually the Buddhist way. We find the mountain, or San Francisco, or the moon within ourselves, right here. That is our understanding, the so-called big mind. Suzuki explained how the Sandokai was written in China to clarify then current misunderstandings and to elevate the dialogue among bickering factions. There was a parallel at Tassahara in that Suzuki and Tatsugami had quite different approaches, and there had to be room in students' minds to include them both. I studied the Sandokai with Suzuki that summer and prepared the blackboard for him every day, writing out the Chinese characters from the ancient poem so he could point to them as he lectured. One day I told him that I'd often stay up all night studying, sometimes even going to bed when the wake-up bell came around and not getting up till after breakfast. It was the complete opposite of the way he had told us to follow the schedule and do each thing at its proper time with everyone else. He nodded his head and held his curved teaching stick. "Keep it up," he said. "Everyone will think you're crazy, but keep it up. It's pretty good." Diane Goldschlag worked in the dining room and was a favorite with the guests because of her warm, outgoing personality. She was from an old-fashioned Jewish section of the Bronx. An adventurous, free-spirited child of the 60s, she'd been arrested protesting the Vietnam War and had hitchhiked around the Middle East, fibbing about her Jewish heritage in Arab countries. She first came to Tosahara in 1968. She and her close friend Margaret were not textbook Zen students. They followed the schedule pretty closely and worked as hard as anyone else, but they were always getting into mischief and breaking the serious quiet with giggles and singing. Once during Dokusan with Suzuki, Diane reached into the sleeve of her robe and brought out a drawing of a fantasy creature with 3 legs and stars for eyes. They crouched over the picture, talking about it like 2 little children. Sometimes he'd call Diane and Margaret into his cabin and give them candy, saying, "You don't need candy, you need salt. I should be giving you salt. I'm not a good teacher for you. I treat you too much like granddaughters, not like students." Once, taking a walk by the creek with a group of students, Suzuki came upon Diane and Margaret skinny dipping. Diane called out that the day was so hot and the creek looked so cool that they just had to jump in. Suzuki shook his finger at them and said, "Remember, you're 2 fishes, not 1. Later that day, about to leave for San Francisco, Suzuki was in his cabin talking over last-minute details with 2 officers when there was a knock on the door. It was Diane. She said she and Margaret had found a beautiful rock and put it in his changing room at the baths. She wanted him to see it and say whether he liked it or not before he left. The 2 officers, visibly upset, said there was no time for that now. Suzuki told them to wait at the gate, and off he went with Diane to see the rock. She had worked with him in his garden and had a good feel for stones. The rock she had placed in the corner of the narrow room was tall and squarish, with white ripples of quartz. Suzuki said, "Oh." inspected it closely, and asked if he could keep it. They walked together to the gate, where a number of students were waiting to see him off. Margaret came running up to say goodbye. "Remember, you're 2 fishes, not 1, he said, getting into the car. When you become a stone, that is our Zazen practice. As usual, Suzuki spent a lot of time working with plants and stones in his garden that summer. During his life, he'd come to understand a good deal about stones, their balance points and breaking points. He said that some stones were alive and others were dead. One day, Suzuki and his attendant Alan Marlowe were trying to rotate a large stone in Suzuki's garden. Alan was 6'4" and muscular, but the two of them could not move the stone, even with the help of a long steel bar. Finally, Suzuki told Alan to go to the baths, the customary end to everyone's workday. Alan went and was surprised half an hour later to find that the rock was reset. He called out at Suzuki's cabin door, opening it when there was no answer. Inside, he found Suzuki asleep. There was vomit around the edge of the toilet. Alan cleaned it off and left. Suzuki stayed in bed for 3 days. Another student, Steve Tipton, was trying to do the hardest job imaginable in the summer heat. There was only one appropriate spot for a septic tank for the new toilets near the baths, and in that spot the Tassahara soil held an enormous granite boulder. There was no room for a crew, so Steve was working by himself. Every day after his bath, Suzuki would stop to check on Steve's progress. Steve had dug a 3-foot wide, 6-foot deep trench around the 7-foot boulder. He was trying to break it up by drilling, placing spikes in the holes, and then driving them in with a sledgehammer. After a week, he had broken off only a few shards. Finally, Suzuki said, "Are you trying to break up that rock?" "I'm trying to," Steve answered. "You got any ideas?" Suzuki motioned for Steve to get off, and he tied back his robe sleeves and leaped to the top of the boulder. He carefully looked at the rock, patted it, and chuckled. He called Steve back and pointed to the surface, here, and here, and here. Steve drilled and drove in spikes where Suzuki had indicated, and the stone broke into pieces that could easily be winched out. That summer was a high point in Suzuki's life, a hard-working, early-rising season of energy and harmony. Tosahara was good, the city was good, Suzuki seemed healthy and strong, and his dream was tangibly unfolding before him. The secret of Soto Zen is just 2 words. Not always so. Not always so was never far away in Shunryu Suzuki's teaching. He prefaced much of what he said with the word maybe, and yet he did not seem at all unsure of himself. When he said this sort of thing, it seemed to come from a deeply rooted strength. He did speak of the absolute, but in enigmatic terms. There is nothing absolute for us, but when nothing is absolute, that is absolute. He talked about Buddha's teaching as something fluid and living. To accord with circumstances, the teaching should have an infinite number of forms. He talked about enlightenment, but said, enlightenment is not any particular stage that you attain. Not always so. In Japanese, it's 2 words, 3 words in English. This is the secret of our teaching. If you understand things in this way without being caught by words or rules, without too much of a preconceived idea, then you can actually do something, and in doing something, you can apply this teaching which has been handed down from the ancient masters. When you apply it, it will help. It couldn't be grasped. It was paradox, he said, that could only be understood through sincere practice and zazen. The point of his talks wasn't to tell the truth as he saw it, but to free minds from obstacles so they might include contradictions. Suzuki thought it was a frequent weakness of Buddhist teachers to cling to a fixed understanding. It was not a weakness of Dogen. Usually a Zen master will give you practice zazen so that you will attain enlightenment. If you attain enlightenment, you will be detached from everything, and you will see things as it is. But our way is not always so. What the Zen master says is of course true, but what Dogen Zenji told us was how to adjust the flame of our lamp back and forth. The point of Dogen Zazen is to live each moment in total combustion, like a kerosene lamp or a candle. Buddhism is a two-edged sword, Suzuki said, pretending to swing a sword, turning his wrist, a mischievous smile on his face. Back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes I strike you with this side and sometimes with that. He often spoke of the dual nature of reality, but what the two sides were was not so easy to understand. It wasn't just oneness and duality, but the duality of oneness and the oneness of duality. He said one couldn't speak the whole truth, that there was always another side created by whatever one said. And if his students didn't get it on their own, they'd get it by the sword that cuts away the side they're attached to. We should understand everything both ways, not just from one standpoint. We call someone who understands things from just one side a tambankan. This means a man who carries a board on his shoulder. Because he carries a big board on his shoulder, he cannot see the other side. Often he said, just keep sitting, very often. Sitting would loosen the grip of what seemed to be reality, but then the idea of sitting or zazen might grip the sitter. Zazen was the first thing he taught, but if it became something too special, he'd pull out the rug. Someone would ask for more periods of zazen, and he'd say the schedule was fine as it is. Someone would speak of pain in their legs, and he'd say, sit more. Even not always so was not always so. It wasn't offered as a formula to cling to. There is no question, a student said, because there is no answer. Whatever you say will not always be so, so I will just sit. Suzuki shook his head. No, the student said, but you said, when I said it, it was true. When you said it, it was false. If there is always another side in Suzuki's teaching, what's the other side of not always so? To look for that, we must take the board off our shoulder. Almost all people are carrying a big board, so they cannot see the other side. They think they are just the ordinary mind, but if they take the board off, they will understand, oh, I am Buddha too. How can I be both Buddha and ordinary mind? It is amazing. That is enlightenment. Suzuki talked about the first principle and the second principle from his early days in San Francisco. He said the first principle had many names: Buddha nature, emptiness, reality, truth, the Tao, the absolute God. The second principle is what is said about the first and the way to realize it: rules, teaching, morality, forms. All those things change according to the person, time, and place, and they are not always so. Suzuki said that talking about Buddhism was not truth, but mercy, skillful means, encouragement. There is no particular teaching or way, but the Buddha nature of all is the same. What we find is the same. The first principle is not something that Buddha or other people came up with. Suzuki spoke about Buddha's sermons in the woods, where he proclaimed the first principle, the royal law, and he added, if you think what Buddha proclaimed is the royal law, that is not right. The royal law was already there before he was on the pulpit. Suzuki taught that Buddhism is not the first principle, but is a way to know and express the first principle. Buddha's teaching can only be thought of as the first principle in its pure and formless form. If you have a preconceived idea of the first principle, that idea is topsy-turvy, and as long as you seek a first principle, that is something to be applied in one way to every occasion, you will have topsy-turvy ideas. Such ideas are not necessary. Buddha's great light shines forth from everything, each moment. Suzuki made clear that the first principle is beyond discrimination or knowing in the ordinary sense, in the way that relative truth is known. Bodhidharma said, "I don't know." I don't know is the first principle. Do you understand? The first principle cannot be known in terms of good or bad, right or wrong, because it is both right and wrong. Once Suzuki divided up the Zendo, those on the right were to ask questions about the first principle, and those on the left about the second. If someone asked about the wrong principle, they'd have to move to the other side of the Zendo. Nobody actually changed sides, though they had a good time trying to present their understanding of the first principle. In the end, it seemed like there was nothing at all to say. Sometimes I'm the teacher and you're the student, and sometimes you're the teacher and I'm the student. A voice called from outside Suzuki's door in polished Japanese. "Ojama shimasu. Excuse me for bothering you." Suzuki opened the door and sighed a delightful ah. Finally, his old student, Graham Petchy, had made it to Tassahara. Graham entered the cabin and they talked as Suzuki poured hot water from a thermos into a teapot. Graham congratulated Suzuki on the marvel of his American monastery and on the wonderful new building in San Francisco. It was June of 1970, and they hadn't met since the fall of 1966 at Rinsoin, before the Petchys went to England. Graham's life had continued to take its own course. He and Pauline had gone back to Japan after a year. In 1967, Suzuki had again tried to get him to come back to Zen Center, but again he was too late. Graham had written back saying he'd come if Suzuki wanted him to break a 2-year-old contract with a firm that had hired him to start an English language school in Japan. The last correspondence Graham received from Suzuki in England was a telegram that simply said, "I agree with your plan to go to Japan." Graham had been living in Tokyo and running the school for over 2 years. He continued to have a relationship with Uchiyama in Kyoto, but his life was now that of a businessman. That night in the Zendo, Graham gave a talk about the old days at Sokochi and studying Zen in Japan. Only a few of the oldest students had ever met him. To the rest, it was a treat to see and hear the almost legendary first Westerner whom Suzuki had personally ordained, the one who first incorporated Zen Center, Richard's old Dharma brother, People wondered why he'd stayed away, and if there was a chance he would return. The next day, Graham and Suzuki talked about Miss Ransom. In 1967, Graham had looked her up in England at Suzuki's suggestion, and he'd taken to visiting her every week or so. Pauline and the children also met her. Pauline said Miss Ransom reminded her of Katharine Hepburn, tall, thin, and elegant, with shoulder-length hair. She liked the way Miss Ransom teased Graham for being so well-dressed and proper in his black suit. She said he looked like a Mormon missionary, except for his shaved head. Ransom had been amazed to see the fundraising brochures for Tassahara and to hear about what her old English student had done. "That little monk has gone off and opened a monastery in the West," she said to Graham. "I just can't believe it." Often when Graham visited, he would hear new stories about her times with that little monk in the late 20s. She told him about the Buddha statue and how that experience had led her to respect Buddhism. The statue had been damaged and was no more. In his letters to Suzuki, Graham sent word of Miss Ransom, his Zendo, and his family. In the fall of 1967, Suzuki had planned to visit the Pecci's and Miss Ransom in England after a trip to the East Coast, but he got too busy with Tosahara and canceled at the last minute. It was a disappointment to all of them. Miss Ransom wrote to her former houseboy, translator, and mentor of Buddhism. Suzuki replied through Zen Center's secretary, Yvonne. Ransom was outraged by this, and Graham sympathized. She sent an angry letter back telling Suzuki to write to her himself. She didn't care how bad his English or his handwriting was. He could put it on a postcard, but he must never write to her again through a secretary. Suzuki stopped answering her letters. It upset Miss Ransom a great deal, and Graham as well. In her old age, she had become a more devout Quaker and regularly went to meetings at the local Friends Hall. She was known in England not for her experiences in Japan, but for her relationship with the last emperor of China, Pu Yi, and his wife, Wan Jung. She had been interviewed on the BBC about Pu Yi and Wan Jung, and there had been some newspaper articles about her. In 1969, her 82nd year, she passed away of emphysema, going peacefully while holding on to a photograph of the young empress. Graham had brought some things that Miss Ransom wanted passed on to Suzuki. There was some 16-millimeter motion picture footage that she took of him in the garden of Zonin in 1930, and a dark brown cup made from a special clay found in her native Somerset. With the cup was a card sending her greetings and asking him to please write. Suzuki put the card to his forehead and placed it carefully on a low table. He picked up the cup with two hands and examined it carefully, as is done in tea ceremony. "Please explain something to me," Graham said earnestly. "Miss Ransom told me so much about the two of you, how close you were, and she always spoke of you with such affection. How could you have written to her through a secretary and then stopped writing her altogether? How could you not respond to her letters? By British standards, that was very rude, especially to a lady of her age and class. I cannot understand it." "The reason I didn't respond," Suzuki replied, "was that she asked me questions about our past, and wanted to check on dates. I was afraid she wanted to write a book about the period of her life when I knew her. Graham was flabbergasted. She had never even written a book about her experiences in China. Graham said he had agreed to do some work and excused himself. He put on work clothes and joined a crew digging in a ditch. Suzuki's attendant came to Graham after about 30 minutes and said Suzuki would like to see him again. Graham said that he had agreed to do this work and would continue to work. They never discussed Miss Ransom again. We get no letters from the world of emptiness, but when you see the plant flower, when you hear the sound of bamboo hit by the small stone, that is a letter from the world of emptiness. A shipment arrived at Page Street one morning in the summer of 1970. Several boxes of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. It was the second book to come out of Zen Center after Ed Brown's wildly popular Tassahara bread book. Students stood around the front hall picking up copies. On the gray dust jacket in black and white was calligraphy done by Suzuki in his cabinet, Tosahara, using a yucca leaf for a brush. It was the Japanese characters Nyorai, or Tathagata in Sanskrit, thus come, one of the 10 traditional names for Buddha. Between the red-lettered title and author's name was the subtitle, Informal Talks on Zen Meditation and Practice. It was a thin hardcover, only 134 pages, with short chapters. Each chapter started with a quote from the text. The prologue, titled Beginner's Mind, carried the quote, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few." There wasn't much thought about the impact the book might have on the Buddhist world or any other world. It was nice to have a little book of Roshi's lectures that could be sent to friends and family. The Wind Bell usually carried only one lecture and was published infrequently. Suzuki and Okusan came downstairs and joined the handful of students. He looked at the book with comic amazement. Okusan was irritated at the picture on the back cover, a black and white close-up of Suzuki's head and shoulders, a picture taken at Tosahara by Robert Boney shortly before he shaved his head and face, done once every 5 days, on 4 and 9 days in a Zen monastery. He wore his stark black Japanese work clothes. His ever-changing face settled into a penetrating, clear gaze, a pleasant hint of a smile, those black eyes with crow's feet like bookends, the slightly raised eyebrow added a suggestion. "In Japan, we would never do this," she said. "Why not a nice, formal picture of Hojo-san in his best robes?" People teased her, and she gave up. Someone showed Suzuki the 2 textless pages in the center of the book, empty except for a small fly on the right side, drawn by his old student Mike Dixon. People left him alone as he looked at the book, which reflected his teaching through the work of Marion Derby, Richard Baker, and Trudy Dixon. After a moment, He moved up next to me and chuckled. "Good book," he said, thumping the cover with an index finger. "I didn't write it, but it looks like a good book." Later, he said, "I read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind to see what the understanding of my students is." Buddhism is transmitted from warm hand to warm hand. "I have some good news for you," Suzuki said, slapping his thighs. It was the fall of 1969, before the move to Page Street. Bob Halperin and I had gone over to Sokoji in the afternoon, and Suzuki had welcomed us into the office. He'd been in bed with the flu, and his students hadn't seen him for a long time. Suzuki continued, "I'm going to Japan to give Richard transmission." Suzuki looked as pleased as he could be. We froze, shocked. "Suzuki Roshi," Bob said after a thoughtful pause, "if you give Richard Baker transmission, everyone is going to think you've gone crazy." "Oh, no, Suzuki said, unfazed. "This is good. You should be happy. Now, when he returns from Japan, you'll have an American teacher." "An American teacher?" "We didn't want an American teacher. We wanted a Japanese teacher, mainly, Suzuki." The Japanese priests seemed to know what they were doing, were comfortable in their roles, and looked the way Zen priests were supposed to look. The peccadillos and shortcomings of Americans were so easy to see. Bob and I both liked Richard, thought he had great energy and kept things lively, and we completely trusted Suzuki's judgment. But Bob knew this would be a tough adjustment to make and was warning Suzuki about what to expect. Bob knew the pulse of the place. Later that day, I ran into Kobun on the street and told him. Kobun recoiled with his hands held in front of him like an actor in a horror movie. No, not Richard. It is a mistake. Maybe Philip. Bob and I were at his communal apartment across the street from Sokoji. Diane dropped by, and we told her about Suzuki's intention to give Richard transmission. "How could that be?" she gasped. "Richard's so arrogant and uptight. He seems to me to be the least spiritual of Suzuki's students." "You think Suzuki will make a good Zen master?" Bob said. Diane looked at him. "No, who on earth?" "Suzuki Roshi." Transmission is the final stage of ordination, in which a priest receives the master's blessing to be an independent teacher in the lineage started by Shakyamuni Buddha. Richard called it the passing on of signless states of mind. At that time, no one at Zen Center knew of any Westerner who had received transmission in the Japanese Zen tradition. There were no examples to observe firsthand, so Suzuki's students tended to see transmission in idealistic terms, as they'd read about it in Buddhist books where it was referred to as mind-to-mind transmission. Nobody paid much attention to Claude, who said it was the equivalent of getting a teacher's certificate. Claude, Suzuki had said in lectures, transmission is nothing special, or actually, there is nothing to transmit. As always, he spent more time knocking away his students' assumptions than creating definitions for them to cling to. But regardless of the contradictory things he'd said about transmission through the years, Suzuki had also talked about his way as transmission Zen, and he insisted on the importance of the master-disciple relationship. My lecture for tonight will be very short, especially after having a good dinner of noodles, which were very long. Our transmission should be a very long one, and our transmission is a special noodle. Dogen Zenji says, when you realize Buddha nature, you are the teacher. You are the teacher of your master, too, and you will be even the teacher of Shakyamuni Buddha. Transmission might be nothing special, but to Suzuki it was indispensable, the living heart of his practice, passing on Buddha's way. He said he was always looking for successors who would share his responsibility. While I was driving Suzuki to Tassahara, he told me of his plans to send students out to teach. You can go to Texas, and others will go to the East Coast, Portland, all over America, even beyond America. I told him I had no interest in going to Texas to start a group. I felt completely unworthy and couldn't imagine I would ever be qualified to do that. Also, I didn't want to go back to Texas, except to visit. I wondered if many students were ready for that. Suzuki said it would take time, but at some point, like baby birds, we'd just be kicked out of the nest and be teachers whether we were ready or not. Surprised, I was quiet for a minute. Then I asked, you mean your disciples will get transmission before they completely understand your teaching? Yes, he said. Well, tell me, Roshi, I went on, have you ever had a student who completely understood your teaching? Yes. How many? One. Man or woman? Man. Was he American? No. Japanese? Yes. What happened to him? He died. After that, as usual, Suzuki fell asleep. American students had always treated Japanese priests with the yellow and brown robes of transmission as if they were semi-celestial beings. It irritated Richard Wim. As soon as Kobun arrived, Suzuki's students treated him with such immense respect, much more than afforded Suzuki's senior students. From Richard's ordination in 1967 to the fall of 1970, Suzuki had ordained 9 students as priests. He ordained a young couple in the summer of 1968 before they went to Japan to study in monasteries, Ron and Joyce Browning. Mel Weitzman, the head of the Berkeley Zen Center, was ordained in 1969. Bill Kwong and Silas Hoadley received their robes early in 1970. Silas had given up his importing business and was involved full-time with Zen Center. Peter Schneider and Dan Welsh took their vows together in 1970. Paul Disco, the builder, and Reb Anderson came later that year. Reb was the newest of the bunch, exceedingly concentrated and devoted to Suzuki. And on New Year's Day of 1971, he was going to ordain a longtime IBM employee named Les K at the Los Altos Zendo. Bob and I were among a half dozen others with whom Suzuki had been discussing priest ordination. One day at the Zen Center, he called Bob and me to his tatami room and told us that he wanted to ordain us together. It was a little hard to imagine. Neither of us had been very successful in learning to control our desires. We were definitely among the loose cannons that Suzuki kept on deck. We considered many of his other lay students to be much better examples to new students and deeper rudders for the community, but we didn't protest. We sat up straight and serious. I just nodded quietly, thinking that if I said anything, he would realize his mistake. He once said, "I think you're all enlightened until you open your mouth." "Do you think we should sit extra zazen at night in order to deepen our zazen?" Bob asked. "The most important point for both of you," Suzuki said, "is not to sit more, but to develop patience. I had the same problem." Then he said, laughing, "To develop patience, you need patience." He raised his left eyebrow and softly said, "The main thing is not to fight." Then he called in Oksan, and they measured us for robes while laughing and teasing us. By now, the 6 ordained priests ordained before Richard were gone or on the periphery of Zen Center. Very few people had heard of Bill McNeil or Bob Hintz, whom Suzuki considered his first 2 ordained disciples. Jean Ross was living in Carmel. A small sitting group met in her apartment. These first 3 were ordained as Suzuki's disciples in Japan by other priests. Graham Pecci was still in Japan and seemed to have drifted away. Philip Wilson had moved north to Santa Rosa with his wife in 1969 before the move to Page Street. He wasn't comfortable with all the new people and hierarchy, and there didn't seem to be any role for him. Claude Dallenberg was involved in the practice at the city center, but he wasn't too happy with the new, bigger Zen Center. He remembered the days when Suzuki talked about getting a large house where 10 or so of them could live communally, like the East-West house. Claude felt that Suzuki had reneged on a commitment to support a basically lay practice Zen Center. By the summer of 1970, 6 priests had been head monks at Tassahara: Richard Baker, Philip Wilson, Claude Dallenberg, Jean Ross, Silas Hoadley, and Mel Weitzman. The others would follow in order of seniority when possible. The presence of more and more American priests at Tosahara and at the city center made a great difference in the atmosphere. Students were considering whether they wanted to receive ordination as priests, mainly those who'd come since Tassahara started. Most of the old-timers who were still around were satisfied with the lay practice they'd developed. Lay practice and lay ordination had not been neglected. In late August of 1970, 36 students took the precepts in the first lay ordination since 1962. Suzuki said he waited that long because he'd been discouraged by the number of people who had quit after ordination. 1 or 2 students had even given back their rakusus. Suzuki felt confident in the commitment of the 1970 ordination group. They'd all been with him at least 3 years. Suzuki and his Sangha were discovering and redefining for themselves what it meant to be a lay Buddhist or a priest in America. They were figuring out what it meant by living with it, learning from their elders, and giving it whatever meaning was in their hearts. They hardly knew what terms to use. Monk was too austere and priest seemed too advanced. Both were used at times, but perhaps priest was more suitable for someone who had received transmission, or at least had gone through the head monk initiation. It was suggested that the new ordinees be called novices, but it didn't catch on. Suzuki emphasized that being a priest was in no way superior to being a layperson. It was just a different role. And what was the difference between these so-called priests and lay people? All the priests except Jean were married or dating. Suzuki had asked Mel not to have any girlfriends for a year, but at the end of the year he told Mel he knew he'd failed. At Tassahara and in the city, nearly everyone, priest or lay, got up early, sat zazen, recited sutras, studied Buddhist texts, and worked hard living semi-monastic lives. In the city, people were free, however, to have private lives and go out together. Many were involved intimately. Some had outside jobs. In several lectures, Suzuki had said, "We are neither priests nor lay, but something in between." Something new was being created at the Zen Center. He was willing to let it take its course. One day, Mel asked Suzuki, "What does it mean to be a priest?" "I don't know," Suzuki answered. Mel would have to find out for himself. For almost a year, Suzuki had been informing people of his decision to give Richard transmission in Japan, and little by little he got their feedback, much of it negative. He asked Silas what he thought, and Silas said that maybe Richard was too smart for the community. "Maybe the rest of you aren't smart enough," Suzuki answered. At a meeting at Tosahara, he finally said that the community was going to have to trust him on this one. "Okay, Roshi, then what does transmission mean?" I asked Suzuki in his office at Sokoji on that day in 1969 when he had told Bob and me of his plan. "Does it mean that Richard is perfectly enlightened and that his mind is the same as the mind of Buddha? Is his understanding complete?" "Oh, no, Suzuki said. "Don't make too much of it. It means that he has a good understanding and a complete commitment." Zen practice is to get to our true mind, the mind not accessible to thinking. This mind cannot be consciously known by ordinary efforts. An unusual effort is necessary. This effort is zazen. Suzuki left for Japan in 1970, planning to stay for 4 months. Aside from performing Richard's transmission ceremony and visiting with family and old friends, he wanted to look for places where he could send students. Oksan convinced him to leave a month early so he could join her and some friends from the Sokoji congregation for a pottery tour on the southern island of Kyushu. She had to beg him repeatedly to go to Kyushu and not to bring any disciples with him. She knew it would be the only real vacation of their lives. Just before they were to leave, he got ill and asked her to go without him. She pleaded, saying he wouldn't have to do anything but rest, and so they went. In old-fashioned Japanese style, Oksan carried his and her luggage, and he carried only a handkerchief. In the hot, muggy, early autumn, they went from town to town and kiln to kiln. He kept up as well as he could. In the evenings, she massaged him and applied acupuncture. He got worse. The second week of the tour, she stayed with him at hotels while the others were out sightseeing. After the tour back at Rinso-in, he finally recovered. Graham came to visit his old teacher at Rinso-in, and Suzuki talked with him about the problem of finding a place to send his students in Japan. Noiri's health wasn't good enough to permit him to take on more students. After visiting some other training temples, Suzuki had concluded that they were not suitable for his students. Eiheiji was clearly too big and weighed down by elaborate traditions. Richard was there and he couldn't stand it. He said it was a total waste of his time, a magnificent place, but not for foreigners to study Zen. It was more of a seminary for Japanese priests to learn priestcraft. In Kyoto, Richard practiced a year at Antaiji with Abbot Kosho Uchiyama, then sat at Daitokuji with Kobori Nanrei Sohaku, a Rinzai teacher. Suzuki wasn't entirely pleased with this choice and didn't want to send people to study koans, but he let Richard decide for himself. You clearly need to go to Antaiji, Graham told Suzuki. The Zazen-only approach appealed to Graham, and so did the abbot, Uchiyama. He didn't try to accommodate the hierarchy as Suzuki did, and he scoffed at the state of Zen in Japan. Graham had been displeased with the growing formality he'd experienced during his visit to Tassahara and hoped that a little of Antaiji's way would rub off on Suzuki, bringing him back to the approach they'd had in San Francisco in the early days. They went to Kyoto and met Uchiyama. In the afternoon, Suzuki gave a brief talk in Japanese to Uchiyama's Japanese Zen students. In the evening, he met with Uchiyama's Western students, and there was a lively 3-hour question and answer session. According to Uchiyama's disciple and translator, Tom Wright, some of the Japanese students who went to the English discussion as well said it was only then, when they heard Suzuki speak in English, that they realized why he had so many students. In Japanese, he just bored them. At Rinso-in, Richard Baker sat on tatami in a room in a far wing off the main hall. With a brush, he was carefully copying the characters for the names of Suzuki's lineage. It was part of his transmission, a private ceremony between the two of them that would take weeks. Suzuki was on the other side of the main hall, meeting old friends and members of the temple congregation. There was almost always someone dropping by. Richard had left Eiheiji before the end of the practice period. He was completely fed up with the hollowness of the practice, which was, for the most part, aimed at getting a temple license. He detested the show of practice put on daily for hundreds of visiting lay Buddhists and busloads of tourists. As it happened with Graham, there was even a particular monk who was out to get Richard. Suzuki tried to get him to complete the practice period. He asked Graham what to do, and Graham told him to insist that Richard stay, even though he himself had experienced enormous difficulty at Eiheiji and understood Richard's feelings. Richard was adamant. Suzuki gave in. It was a big embarrassment to Suzuki, but he cared more about Richard than about Eiheiji and accepted his decision. At Rinso-in, Richard got frustrated because Suzuki just kept meeting with people and ignoring him, leaving him by himself in the back wing. Finally, Richard went into the family quarters and told Suzuki that if he didn't have any time for him, he'd go back to Kyoto, where his wife and daughter were. Suzuki started spending more time with him. Richard stayed, and on Buddha's Enlightenment Day, December 8, 1970, the ceremony of transition from master to disciple was completed. Before heading back to the States, Suzuki went to headquarters in Tokyo and tried to register Richard and his other priests with the Soto organization. He had tried the same in 1966 and gotten nowhere. Suzuki was too much of a maverick, and his disciples hadn't followed the prescribed path. Japanese monks were routinely registered with pretend ceremonies and qualifications, but there was no leniency for him and his barbarians. Richard wasn't aware of Suzuki's efforts to register his disciples. He remembered Suzuki saying that Zen Center shouldn't have any official relationship with Japanese Soto Zen, just a friendly one. For instance, after receiving transmission, there is a ceremony in Japan called 10A, wherein a priest receives recognition of transmission from the Soto school. In this ceremony, the priest is abbot for a day of both Eiheiji and Sojiji and carries an ox hair whisk. Suzuki told Richard, "But I think you should go to the White House in Washington, D.C. and wave your whisk there." While still in Yaizu, Suzuki went to see his family doctor. Suzuki said he felt fine, but Dr. Ozawa said his liver was very weak. "See," Oksan said, responding to this news, "you should let Richard take over Zen Center. Stay here. I'll go back to San Francisco to get your stuff and come back to take care of you." "No," he said, "it's time for us to return. I want to celebrate New Year with my students at Page Street." Comments on Chapter 17 of Crooked Cucumber, The Life and Zen Teaching of Shunryu Suzuki. It starts off, we're going down the creek. Actually, I was at Tassahara, but I did not go on that walk. I remember when they came back, though. A bunch of people went down creek to the Narrows. It was a day off. I don't know why. I might have been studying like Japanese or the Sandokai or one of those things. And those days off, or the 4 and 9 days, sometimes I'd really get into it. But anyway, and also another thing was I always managed to spend time with Suzuki more than most people because people were considerate and always saying, "Oh, we should leave Roshi alone," and they'd go through the proper channels, talk to the Jisha. When can I talk to him? I just go over to his cabin, or I just go bug him, So, something like that. They're going down creek. That's good. Let everybody else go. And another thing is, I really don't like group things. And I ended up doing a whole group thing. I love being at Tassahara and at Zen Center, and I've loved being at Dharma Sangha in Europe, and I loved relating to Sogenji in Japan when I was in Kyushu in that little temple. But I don't like going on hikes with groups and stuff like that. All right. So anyway, they're going down there, and it says, taking handfuls of water from the creek. You can't do that now, or you're not supposed to do that now, because now all the creeks in California have Giardia. But back then they didn't. And we had nothing against drinking creek water. And wow, I mean, that's really remote. You know, I still drink creek water when I'm down there, so it's hard for me not to. I've got the habit. And I haven't gotten Giardia yet. And I might not ever get back there. I sure would like to, but we'll see. Oh, it says there's a rule against going skinny dipping in the Narrows. I'm going to add to that. There's a rule, a student rule. There's a rule that students can't go skinny dipping in the Narrows. We don't make rules for guests. And, you know, like it also says, you know, depending on who the person was, we wouldn't pay any attention to it if we weren't with a lot of people or something. Like if Diane and I went down and there was just the two of us, and, you know, she and I got married, we go skinny dipping. Oh, good Lord, we leave our clothes and just start walking down creek naked. It's really remote. It's so wonderful. It is so extremely remote there. It's hard to get that remote. And if you go up creek, you feel even more remote. And I've been up creek and gone off creeks, little creeks that are coming into Tassahara Creek, gone up into the hills, and I've sat up there, you know, and you just get to these out-of-the-way little places, and, you know, some of it, you got to climb around things, and there's no trail at all or anything, you know, it's just really wilderness. You think, wow, I'd be sitting there, and I'd think, man, there might never have been a person where I'm sitting right now. And then I'd look over and see a cigarette butt down or something. Every once in a while, I'd find a arrowhead. So Suzuki was giving this talk in San Francisco in 1971 in June. He's saying that I told you how I practice shikantaza or zazen. He said, so that's my way. I don't know how other teachers sit. But anyway, this is my shikantaza. And I started this practice 2 years ago after I went down creek at Tosahara. Perhaps some of you were there swimming with me. I'm paraphrasing some of this with me at that time. And there were some beautiful girl students. And Peter Schneider, you were there. Cannot swim, actually, but because they were enjoying swimming so much, I thought I may join. But I couldn't swim. But there were so many beautiful girls over there. I think he's joking. He just went in because there were a bunch of students in there. But there were so many beautiful girls. Now, the Narrows is a fairly small swimming hole. Maybe there were a dozen people with him or something. And there's this granite. It's just solid granite leading up to it in the water. When there's good water in the creek, like this is June, if there's been plenty of water in this spring, it'll be like cascading down into it. You can get down in there and slide down over a little waterfall that goes, 5 feet down, something like that, 6 feet. You can just slide right down it and into the water, and you can slide over to the side. Only if there's a lot of water is it going over on the side, but it'll still be you can slide down there into the, and it's pretty deep down there. It's like 12 feet down or something. But it's not, and there's a lovely little cliff up above it that's maybe 10 feet. You can jump off that into it. And Bob Alpin and I used to jump off the side of the cliff up there. That's really dangerous, man. I don't even like to remember that. We did it we took Kobun down there in 67 and showed him the Narrows, right? And then we started getting up on the side of the cliff, like there's a walkway below it, right? And it's like 3 feet. And we're climbing up higher, and jumping off that, we have to clear the walkway and go down into that pool. And he's down there begging us, please don't. And, you just barely clear it. It's the way a lot of young guys get killed and injure themselves, is foolish jumping into water. But anyway, so Suzuki says that there were so many beautiful girls over there, so I tried to go there without knowing I couldn't swim. He means without thinking, without remembering I couldn't swim. So I almost drowned. He's laughing, and the audience is laughing. But I knew that, I will not die. I will not drown. I shan't be drowned. I shall not be drowned to death, because there are many students, so someone will help me, he laughs. And then he says, but I was not so serious. What he means to say there, I didn't take it seriously. But, the feeling was pretty bad, He means being down in the water, not being able to do anything. The feeling was pretty bad. Water is, I am swallowing water, laughs. So feeling was too bad. So I stretched my arm, so that someone catch me, but no one laughs. Laughter means the audience is laughing. No one helped me. So I decided, to go to the bottom to walk. But that was not possible either. I couldn't reach to the bottom. I couldn't get over the water. He means he couldn't get up to the top. What I saw is beautiful girls' legs, but I couldn't, take hold of them. I was rather scared. And at that time I realized, now listen to what he says, right? He's drowning. He says, at that time I realized that we will never have good practice unless we become quite serious. I get the question sometimes by people and say, there's this thing that goes around the internet. Zen is too important to take it seriously, Shunryu Suzuki or something. People say, did he say that? And I say, well, nowhere I know of. But I said, well, it's not outside of the way he felt. And he would frequently say, don't be too serious, or you're being too serious, and that person's too serious. But he'd also say, you've got to take it seriously. So why is he on both sides of that? Because when he says, don't be too serious, he means don't get caught up in a serious emotion. But when he says take things seriously, he's talking about what you do, applying yourself. So he said, when you don't, at that time I realized we will never have good practice unless we become quite serious. He means unless we take it seriously, unless we realize that this is the thing to do in life. But it doesn't mean to have a serious attitude. It means to apply oneself. So, but I knew I was not dying at that time. So I was not so serious. So he means here, because I didn't take it seriously, I still didn't think that I was in danger of dying. So I had a very difficult time. But if I'd been you, I would have thought I was dying. No, that's not the way he said it, but that's what he means. I know. But here's what he means. If I'd really thought I was dying, I wouldn't struggle anymore. What I'd do is stay still. But because I thought, I'll have another moment. So I didn't take it too seriously. Since then, I started doing Shikan Taza, expecting another moment after moment. I tried to sit, as if I'm dying, in the water. That helps a lot. Since then, my practice improved a lot. This is why And I've tried a long time, and I have good confidence in my practice. So I told you, how I sit my Shikan Taza. It was a very interesting experience. I was among beautiful girls, laughs. Here, I'm going to play you Suzuki from the tape, just sort of concluding that.
When you practice Zazen, you should not be caught by, you shouldn't be involved in gaining idea. The most important thing is to confront with yourself and to be yourself. Then naturally, you can accept things as they are. And you can see things as they are. You will have a perfect wisdom at that time. That is why I told you my way of Zazen.
Well, thank you, Suzuki Roshi. I appreciated the visit. I thought it was really nice when he gave talk afterwards, and he said, he's talking about, hey, let's start counting our breaths. He decided we need to take this seriously, and let's do the most simple practice, counting breaths. So we did. We started counting breaths then, and then we counted breaths for a year or so. And he said he was doing it too. I was terrible at it. I wouldn't get past one sometimes. I'd get bang, and then the bell would ring. I was studying too much and staying up too late. And I count my breath now, though, a lot. Not always, but now I can do it. And this morning, I have a lot on my mind, and especially if I have a lot on my mind, I'll count, because that can take the place of having a lot on my mind. I don't just count from 1 to 10 over and over. I don't have a timer. I counted from 1 to 250, and then, I just sat for a while after that. But I count from 1 to 250 by counting from 1 to 10. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 for each breath, and then 9, 20, 9, 30. So, when he says the term shikantaza, that means just sitting. Of course, I assume you know that, but some people don't. Shikan, that means just. Taza is to sit. Suzuki knew that when he talked too much about enlightenment, people tended to get fixed ideas about what the word meant and got obsessed with it as a goal. Well, that's okay. I think it's better to say, and get obsessed with it as a goal. So I'm going to change it to that. But I see you could say the other thing. Last chapter, maybe, there was an errata that I realized wasn't an errata. And I didn't mention it because it was so embarrassing. And I had even, like some years ago, a few years ago, noticed it and announced there was a new errata I found in Crooked Cucumber. And I posted something about it on What's New blog. And I looked at it this time and said, well, wait a minute. Oh, it was right the way it was. This isn't right. And I wonder, what was I thinking? So anyway, it was sort of embarrassing, so I just wanted to erase it from history and not suffer the shame and embarrassment of exposing what it was. I can't even remember what it was right now. So it says, so in the summer of 1970, this is after Tatsugami's first practice period, a segment of a film on gurus called Sunseed was shot at Tassahara. That film was just re-released. And I've been in touch with the gentleman who produced it. He had all sorts of questions. First, he made me take it off. Well, it just was sort of automatic. It was, when they did a search for it, they found that it was on YouTube. I'd taken I had the entire thing, the segment of the film, it was like 12 minutes on YouTube. I not only had the whole thing, I had it divided, I had it in parts too, so that when Alan Marlowe was talking, you could see just him and just Bill Shurtleff and just Meg Goller and just Suzuki. It's the only film we have no, it's not. No, the KQED film he's talking, but it's color film with him talking. So anyway, they wanted it taken off. Ridiculous, because in no way is it going to interfere with them releasing this documentary of different gurus. But it's out now. You can just Google Sunseed. It's funny. I don't see the re-release of it on IMDb, but it's on YouTube, Sunseed The Journey. And now they got Peter Coyote narrating it. And it's directed by Amartat Kohn, Frederick Kohn, who lives in Kuala Lumpur, and, got hold of me when he was working on it to bring it back out. And he's a producer, too, and Ralph Silver's a producer. And Ralph Silver used to come to Zen Center some. Anyway, I remember when the crew was there. It was a lot of fun. They were neat. And it's I'm looking forward to seeing the whole movie again. And I'll feature it on Cuke What's New blog. I haven't done that yet. I should do that. There's also, of course, a lot of film on ShunyuSuzuki.com. Actually, all the film of Suzuki and Tassahara Zen Center is on ShunyuSuzuki.com. I think 4 or 5 different filmmakers. A couple of them are very short, and one of them's medium length. And it's of Suzuki giving a talk of the Sandokai, right, about what we're reading now in this chapter. And then Michael Winger and Timothy O'Connor Fraser worked on it. Fraser's the one who did it. He synced the audio from the Sandokai talk to the black and white film with no sound that was taken in the Zendo. So it's really cool. And that's on ShunyuSuzuki.com. And that's on the Cuke video YouTube. Anyway, yeah, all right, very good. Yeah, and it talks about how in 1970 Sterling Bennell came down and gave a talk on the geological history of Tosahara. I have a section for Sterling Bennell on Cuke.com, and you can read windbell pieces from him there. Really brilliant man. And, he was a very close friend of Zen Center. He went to Tassahara many times. And it says he talked about how Tassahara is the meeting place of 3 ecological zones. I glanced through the stuff he'd written that was in the windbell. Maybe I zipped over it, but I didn't see him listing them. But I do remember him telling me that, so that might be the source of that. All right, what were they? All right, it was like the southern desert, crept up. And you can really see that in the yucca plants, and, you can see that. And then the some part of that, maybe the, forested lands, there were both, in those mountains, there were pines and oaks coming in. And then chaparral. Here, let me read you a little bit from Sterling. He's so great. This is just the first paragraph from fairly long article he had in the Windbell, long for the Windbell, called Impressions of the Tassahara Landscape. These mountains are young in a geological sense, and even now rising. Streams notch them deeply and have not had time to broaden the steep-walled canyons to gentler slopes and shapes. The sun's heat and long rainless seasons make water scarce, a condition shaping the pattern of plant distribution. The north-facing hillsides are not so dry and are covered with forests of oak, madrone, California laurel, and other broadleaf trees. But the south-facing slopes feel the sun longer and more intensely, and they support grasses, shrubs, and patches of chaparral dominated by chamise and manzanita, all plants adapted to drought and fire. There are many cliffs and outcroppings of sedimentary rock, once formed in horizontal layers on the ocean bottom many millions of years ago, now twisted and convoluted by the undulations and upthrust of the mountains. Waves of water roll and break in seconds, those of rock in eons. All right, that's the first two paragraphs. Great. Oh, I love Sterling. God. Came down there once. He loves snakes. Maybe it was him. I think it was him who brought a couple of what are those snakes called? He brought a couple of gopher snakes to get the gophers in our garden. And I remember, and gopher snakes look a little like rattlesnakes without a rattle. They're sort of gray-brown, and they can be pretty long. And a guest came in the office. I was in the office, and a guest walked in holding one of those gopher snakes. A lot of people wouldn't do that. Most people wouldn't do that, He said, "Oh, there was already a guest in my room. I thought you might want to know." And Sterling taught me how to catch rattlesnakes, which I did a number of times there. He was fearless. I mean, it frightened me. I said, "Hey, Sterling, there's a rattlesnake down in the barn somewhere." And this was in a room where Bob Beck had a bunch of furniture stored. He hadn't moved out yet. I said, "Oh, darn." There's my doggie. I said, "Oh, darn. I don't see it now." He said, "Well, maybe it went under this cabinet here." And he reached his arm in where you couldn't see and felt around. Good Lord. Anyway, we didn't find the snake that day. I don't know what happened to that one. But actually, they're pretty easy to catch. I just get a big trash can, put it on its side, and sort of sweep them over there. Or, I'd like have maybe a rake, and just, they're not aggressive. They want to get away, so I'd sort of nudge them this way and that, and they'd go in it. Then I'd ride it and put the top on it and put it in the back of the pickup, and I'd drive it up the road beyond where our watershed was. So it would go down into another watershed. Maybe that watershed joined with ours, but they'd be pretty distant. And I'd just go down and turn the can over, and it'd go slithering away, and it would just almost always just immediately go down off the road and down the side. And a couple of times walking on the path, a guest or a student would come upon one in the trail. I think we had one woman I know of there's been one guest bitten by a rattlesnake in Tassahara history, and she got helicoptered out. And, when you get up into those northern zones, there's very few deaths from rattlesnake bites up there. I mean, you can die. You take it very seriously. More people were getting injured from cutting themselves in some places when they get bitten, and they damage themselves by cutting too much. But anyway, I can't remember exactly how you're supposed to do all that right now. I haven't lived. Oh, I live with cobras now. You can't. It won't help you to cut anything with them. Because the cobras attract your nervous system. A lot of rattlesnakes do, but that's in the hotter climates. Up there where Tosahara was, it was a type that had a poison that went in your bloodstream. God, I think Sterling told me there's like 5 different types of rattlesnake poison. But when he'd screw around with snakes, I'd say he brought a snake over to Yvonne's once when my mother was visiting, right? To show her a snake. And anyway, it wasn't poisonous. She wasn't real wild about that. But I said, Sterling, you got to be careful handling poisonous snakes. And he said, if you know how to do it, it's not dangerous. I said, Sterling, I've read many times about professional snake people, what do they call it, somethings, dying. In a zoo, the guy in charge of the snakes will be bitten by some snake they have, and they won't have any venom. But anyway, he did not. He did die a few years back, and not from snakes. Interesting how Tatsugami is the one that got us to stop serving any meat or fish to the guests. There wasn't that much. It was like less and less every year, like I said. But he said, no, they'll understand. This is a Buddhist monastery. You're not supposed to have any meat or fish here. Of course, he liked to have alcohol there, but I mean, just for a party. So as an exception, when Jean Ross visited him, she had a little sitting group in Carmel, which is just a couple hours from Tassahara out there in Monterey County. Well, I could make it in an hour and a half, I think. And I'm not talking about driving fast. Just, I think you'd be made in an hour and a half. It's as close as anything except for Carmel Valley. And so she drove in one day to visit him, and she brought a big old bottle of whiskey. And they just sat in there and talked and drank for hours. She'd known him when she was at Aheji. She was the first person from Zen Center to go to Aheji, if you remember that. Oh, but about the meat. Now, my memory is, that summer of 1970, I ran the dining room again. I did it 67, 68, the first half of 69, and then 70. I loved it. That was a great job. And then 71, I was assistant director, and Dan was director. And so I got to spend a lot of time with the guests in that job, too. Assistant directors like being vice president. Really very free. But, I always kept busy, so it didn't matter. Anyway, I remember, I think Frances Thompson, who was a Tenzo or head cook, she said we still serve some meat in 70. But Ed says we didn't. But Ed wasn't Tenzo in 70. But I thought we didn't. But, it doesn't matter. There's a number of things where you have conflicting, people will have conflicting dates and years and stories. Yeah, I love the way Diane, back then Diane Goldschlag now, Diane comes in and Suzuki's with the officers getting ready to leave, and she says, Roshi, oh, we have a very special rock I want to see. And they're going, you know, they're saying, hey, we're busy. He's leaving. Don't bother him. And he says, no. And so he goes with her down to the baths. And from his, and there's the cars waiting to leave and everything. From his cabin to the baths, 150 yards, I'm guessing. I don't know. Anyway, it's a walk. Takes his time. And it's a beautiful stone. God, it might still be there. I wonder if it is. I mean, those same baths aren't there anymore. Beautiful stone. That sort of continuity just isn't done at Zen Center. Things I think this was his special stone given by, a student to him, and he loved it and he kept it here. Now, when I spent about 4 months living right near, just a few minutes walk away from the Ramana ashram in Tiruvannamalai in Tamil Nadu, India. And Gita Gayatri, who's a priest in the Zen Center, also involved with a Hindu group, an ashram group there that I really loved and spent some time in their ashrams. She had connections, and she got me into the Ramana archive. And that was the Ramana archive, walking into that building, and it was, it wasn't something that was open to the public. It was like leaving India. I mean, India, you get used to the smells and the sounds, and there's noisy everywhere and stuff. It had perfect temperature, humidity control, and it had like locks of his hair, fingernails, everything he'd touched. I mean, I admire people at Zen Center for being so unattached to things, but so much little historical stuff that's nice. That, if you want to have the Buddhas and the nice Zendo and offer incense to Buddhas and stuff, that's, a type of attachment to form. It would be nice to have preserved his garden outside his cabin, which wasn't done. But that, people would say, oh, no, that's the abbot's garden. Only the abbot can work. But the abbot, Richard Baker, he wasn't a gardener. He never did that. There were people around who'd worked with Suzuki on that garden who could have maintained it, and they knew how he wanted it, there's other things I could talk about. Lack of continuity there. But, the lack of attachment to material is also inspiring. Love that story about Steve Tipton working on that rock and then Suzuki hopping over. And I remember that. That was a boulder. That was a big thing. I mean, it was like, I don't know, it was like 9 feet long and say 4 feet, 5 feet wide. And it was a big old fat thing in the ground. It went down really far. And, just every day, Steve's there working on it. Then Suzuki hops over and goes here and here and here. There was an Italian stonemason who came down there, too, who had that sort of knowledge of stones that was very impressive. Anyway, Steve Tipton, if you want to hear more from Steve Tipton, there's a very long podcast with him that went up Saturday, August 1st on Cuke Audio Podcast. He's been at Emory University for years and is a highly prominent American sociologist and theologist. Is that what you say? Theologian. Anyway, I don't know if you call Steve a theologian, but he's like, and the positions change, and he's got the so-and-so chair there, but he's the senior person there, and he's definitely their prize in that area. He talks about in his podcast about putting together the team that did Habits of the Heart, which is, as far as I know, the largest selling book on sociology. It's on America. And it's been, very successful. He said, not as successful as In My Beginner's Mind. And he's written a number of books. Anyway, we go over that in his podcast. But he's also a fun guy. We've had fun with music and just getting together. And anyway, I miss him. He's one of the people I would see, every year or so when he'd come to the Bay Area. But not now. I'm being held hostage here in Bali. I met with Joan Amaril's group in Beverly, Massachusetts on a Zoom thing, Sunday. That was neat. Somebody asked me in that if in writing and doing this work, if I ever fudge the facts some to make the story better. And I thought about it and I said, well, with Suzuki, no, I don't. But actually in Crooked Cucumber, there are some places where I did that, and I mentioned them where I'd combine or say it was Bob Halper instead of me or me instead of Bob and that sort of thing. If I had it to do now, I wouldn't do that. And also, I'm still not clear about, his godfather back in Japan. Oitsu said he just had one, but looks to me like he had two. But I it's like too late for me to figure that out. And it's all right. Who cares? Nice to leave it something for others to do later. Anyway, one little thing I was just thinking that I used the quote, what is it? Yeah, I love it. The secret of Soto Zen is just 2 words, not always so. So I leave it there because it's funny. But actually right afterwards, he says, and I put that quote a little later, he says 2 words in Japanese, 3 words in English. But all right, there's something, I did that for the effect. I was just playing. Isn't it great to be involved with a teacher who says not always so and doesn't come down with a list of absolutes to believe in absolutely? God, how lucky I am to have run into the people I've run into, not just him, starting with my mother and father. Been very lucky in life. I must have been a good person in the last life. And that where Suzuki says to the student, when I said it was true, when I said it was true, when you said it was false. That's Stan White. He told me that. Stan White, there was a great character. Read his long interview, probably more than one, on Cuke.com. It's great. And then there's the quote, sometimes I'm the teacher and you're the disciple, and sometimes you're the teacher and I'm the disciple. Or he'd say, sometimes I'm the teacher and you're the student, and sometimes you're the student and I'm the teacher. That was not always so. I mean, I remember people, give him a hard time in a lecture and him saying, I think you should go start your own group. Somebody who was probably the first time coming there for a lecture. So then Graham Petchy came to Tassahara. Graham came in 70 in June. So it's very upsetting, the exchange he had about Nona Ransom and Suzuki not having answered her. Oh, God. And, but anyway, another case of him not saying anything, not doing something when he should have. I mean, in my opinion. It always bothers me a little when I come to that. But anyway, nobody's perfect. So Graham gave a talk. Incidentally, Graham and I went to England in the fall of 2000, and we did. It was nice. We went to, I think it was Somerset, where Nona Ransom had lived, and met with people who knew her, and sat with her Quaker group, and we paid our respects there. And we visited with Harry Ransom Rose, Nona Ransom's adopted son, and had dinner with him. And I've gotten a great deal from him on Cuke.com. He was very helpful, and I really enjoyed meeting him. A very interesting man with a very interesting history of his own. And he's got I think his son was running a big department store there, and I almost got hold of him once. Well, anyway. And also, Graham and I visited with Irmgard Schlegel, who was then called by her students Myokyo Ni. And Irmgard Schlegel was a character I'd heard of and was really happy to meet her. She had studied with and became a teacher out of the temple that Ruth Fuller Sasaki was running at Daitokuji. And I remember talking to people who dealt with her when they were there. But anyway, it was just great meeting her. And I write about that trip that Graham and I took. I can see it was 12 days in England. And I call it the 12 Days of England. 12 Days of England. And I just write that in the site search box on Cuke.com. It'll come up. Oh, I remember I wrote that, and the tricycle wanted something, so I wrote that, and they actually had in an issue, next issue we have, and they said 12 Days of England from David Chadwick, but it didn't make the next issue. Something else came up that they wanted to put in, but it's still there on Cuke.com, saved for eternity, which might not be much longer. And Graham gave a talk at Tassahara, and I'm going to play you a few minutes of that talk. And I might, a little later, have a podcast that features Graham and plays the whole talk. I'll tell you one thing, I have to edit the heck out of it. I'll tell you a really weird thing. Graham was a very proper person, and like it says in there that Miss Ransom made fun of him for being so straight. She said he looked like a Mormon missionary all dressed with his suit, but he was very proper, and he liked being that. He had this identity of being a proper English gentleman. But when he talked in his talk, he's coughing like, it's obviously not putting his hand over his mouth or anything, frequently. And I think, my God, I know now that Suzuki did cough way back when Graham was there. Graham had left, before I got there. So this is the first time I met him. He and I became very, very close. I mean, right up to when he died. I was talking to him on the phone from here in Bali. But I knew that Suzuki had coughed back then, and because this is not like Graham. He's copying his teacher, because Suzuki coughed all the time when he talked. Now, I've got a little of Suzuki's talk on here, but I edited the coughs out. But it's really interesting, and long spaces. I can't leave all those spaces in, so I shorten the time between a lot of things that are being said. But anyway, it's neat to hear his voice, so you'll hear a little bit of it now.
Good evening. It's been almost 6 years since I last came to Tassahara. In those days, Philip Wilson and his wife and myself used to come down here quite regularly. And we would sit in the hills around here and practice Zazen. We used to, in those days, dream of having some monastery or temple in these hills here. And it seems almost incredible to me that since I've been away, the whole thing has been realized. And realized with an excellence that I never ever believed possible. One of the things which is most clear to someone coming out of a Japanese temple into this temple here is that many of your ways appear to have Japanese ways or ways of doing things, but it's quite clear that you have already developed your own way, your own very clear way, very sound way. And I was thinking while I was having lunch today that when I was here we were still practicing Japanese Zen. But now I have to practice or learn to practice American Zen. It has quite different flavor in some ways. The whole feeling and situation of Zen Shinji is an expression of perfect enlightenment in itself. It reminds me of the classic story, or shall we say, that's of the lotus rising out of the muddy waters. It seems to me that I come from some of the muddiest waters on the face of this earth in Tokyo, and I live among them. Whereas here, you live in such ideal perfection.
That's really great hearing Graham's voice. Thank you, Graham. So I already got that audio for his talk on Gook.com. I just haven't linked it to his page yet, which I will do immediately. I should have done it decades ago, but anyway, shame on me. Oh yes, and one important thing that Graham brought with him when he came on that trip was the films. Although, yeah, he didn't bring them to Tassahara. I think he told me he just went to the Green Gulch office and handed it over to somebody at the Green Gulch office. And that might have been later. He did bring the films from England, but at one time I didn't know where they were, and it seemed like they were lost. He said, well, I gave them to somebody in the Green Gulch office years ago. And I went, what? So I finally found them. They were in the Zen Center safe in the city. And those are great. You look at those films on ShunyuSuzuki.com. It's Ranson's film from the mid-30s. They're terrific. And now, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Some boxes have arrived in the building and in the prologue, right? I think it says, yeah. As the famous quote, the most quoted quote, in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's there are few. Here's how he said it originally. According to the oldest transcript I have, we don't have the audio for that. In beginner's mind, we have many possibilities, but in expert mind, there is not much possibility. So you can see in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few. That's a good edit of that. And that's really what he wanted. He didn't want his lectures presented the way I have, verbatim on the internet for everybody to see. But there are many edited, we have the edited versions to it, unless they're in books that are being sold commercially. Except for two chapters of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, we have on Shunryu.Suzuki.com because there's no other version of them. I added in the text there, it says a picture, that talking about the picture on the back that Oksan is going, oh, why did you use that? He needs to shave and he's in his work clothes and he's dirty, and why not a nice formal picture of him in his formal robes like they do in Japan? And it said we teased her and she gave up. It's a great picture, and that picture is, wow, has that been used a lot? So I think I should have mentioned Robert Boney, the guy who took the picture. So now I put in there a picture taken by Robert Boney at Tassahara, and Robert took many photographs for Zen Center. There's I think there's one photograph of his in the insert photographs in Crooked Cucumber. Well, I know there's one. I don't think there are two. Yeah, there's one. I know because I sent his widow, Katrina Boney, Katrina with a C, a check for it, which I didn't have to, but it seemed right. Now, if you go on zmbm.net, that's sort of like a facade that takes you into the Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind section on Cuke.com. You can see there's a chart for different versions of the lectures, and you can read the oldest versions. And the 50th anniversary edition just came out, and I wrote an afterword for it, which I'm sure I've mentioned in other podcasts. And you can read that on, on Kook.com. And there's lots of fun facts in there about the making of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. In fact, there could be a whole podcast just on Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Well, there could be more than that. Now, one line that was changed from the way the book used to be, he said to Peter Schneider, he didn't necessarily say this to Peter at that time. He said, I read Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind to see what the understanding of my disciples is. That's what it said in the book. And then Viktor Sergeyev, who did the Russian translation, some years ago, 10 years ago, within the last 10 years. They were translating from the 40th anniversary issue, which had an afterword by me in it. And they translated that, and so that's how we got in contact. And had a lot of contact. It was great. I learned a lot from them. And I've got his notes on the ZMBM section of Cuke.com. Because they're doing another one now, and they're translating the 50th, my afterward for the 50th. And I've mentioned Victor before in podcasts that they did a meticulous, detailed search on everything and analyzed everything, and they suggested some edits that would have been better. Now, some of their suggestions are reflected in the new edition, but we because I was dealing with Shambhala on it, but we're not going to get into re-editing the book. There are some edits. I mean, Victor pointed out, hey, look, the way he said it here in this earliest transcript is more clear than the edited version, in one paragraph. there were a few that made suggestions, and they said, well, this is misleading. This isn't really what he was saying there. Just a few places like that. But also, he took exception of this line, and he went back and looked at Peter Schneider's interview, which is where it came from, and he said, look, it's the understanding of his disciples. He only had a few disciples, and there were only two of them. I mean, if we're going to call Trudy a disciple, disciples are people who are ordained. It's only Richard and Trudy. So it means he sees what the understanding of Richard and Trudy was. I said, nah, you're taking it too literally. He just means, he sees the understanding of his students in the material that was selected or something. It's just an offhand statement. Don't take it too seriously. He's being, and like when he said, nice book, he said to me, nice book. I didn't write it, but it's a nice book. I wouldn't take that too seriously either. It's very close to what he said. So he really did write it, and he spoke it. But, he's sharing the limelight with others when he says that. And also, he's recognizing that it took a lot of people to bring that about. So anyway, now it says, I read Zen my beginner's mind to see what the understanding of my students is. And Peter, so I got a hold of Peter. We're talking about that. Peter said, that's what he said to me. He didn't say disciples. And he said, it might even be on tape saying he said disciples, but I spoke wrong. Oh, one thing I wondered about, it said, we didn't know when we hear that Dick's going to get transmission. And, he went over this book and was very helpful on it. He said he was a little hurt when he saw all that stuff about him getting ordained. Well, he was always controversial. I said, well, it shows that you were controversial when you were a student, not just when you became the abbot and afterwards. And that Suzuki chose you as his successor then. I said, sorry, you're a public figure. I can't hide that. And I said, anyway, I just hinted at it. You were worse than that. I liked him. He was fun. And Zen Center with him was fun. That's one thing that Rick Levine pointed out, is that some of the stuff that's been written about back then, it's so serious and, it's so judgmental and accusatory and everything. And so a lot of that stuff is true. It tends to be exaggerated, way exaggerated, and indicate to me what is a false picture that doesn't give credit where credit's due. But Rick Levine, who agrees with a lot of the criticism, he says, but one thing is it was fun. We had a great time, and we learned a lot, and it was exciting. It was great. It was great back then. Now, but people needed to have their own power. That's what I told him when I left. But I always stayed close, and I came back and did things. But I stopped being a full-time company man after 10 years. I said, I need to find my own power. But I never rejected, and we always stayed close. Remember, the world's full of flawed people, and they're the ones that carry the ball forward. And there are no exceptions. It says that we didn't know of any other Westerners who'd received transmission. I'd like to know if there were any. I didn't look into that thoroughly enough, but I can remember writing Taigen about it in Chicago, one of the first podcast guests I had. That's a question that could be answered, but G.U. Kennett got transmission around then. I think she might have had it then. She got it she was at Sojuji. She came to Zen Center. Oh, yeah, we were still at Sokoji when she came. So she came, before November of, because I can remember her and her students there staying. We put them up, when they first came for her to figure stuff out, figure out where she's going to be. So she'd been at Sojiji in Japan, and she had, transmission in Soto Zen, and she was fully recognized by the organization there. I mean, she did it all by the book and started Shasta Abbey north of San Francisco and created a type of what seemed to be sort of an Anglican Zen. She was from England. But she's very well respected, and it's a really nice place, I hear. I've never been there, but I've always wanted to go. I hear good things about it. Philip Wilson got a relationship with her later on and was close with her. And Walter Nowick had transmission from the great Rinzai master Zuigan Goto, who was at Daitokuji. Soko Morinaga was one of Goto's 3 Dharma heirs, and I met him in Kyoto. I spent an hour and a half with him because I brought some esteemed guests to visit him and got to hear a translation by Ursula, who was his Dharma heir. And who's got she's a Zen teacher in, I think, Garberville. I might have that wrong. And she was married to Daijo, who was at Sogenji, where I was, and who taught with her in Garberville and tragically died not long ago. Too young. I'd first met Ursula right when I first got to Kyoto. I stayed in the place where she was, which it was this house near Myoshinji where Nakamura Sensei had been staying. And gosh, I don't know what the connection was. Maybe something to do with them. I don't know. I don't know how I got there. But she was very nice. I really liked her. And I liked Morinaga. And they were both students of his. And I liked him. And I liked what he had to say. And he said it in very simple, clear Japanese that I could understand. And I liked that a lot. And he had a beautiful temple. That was a sub-temple of Ryoanji, the most famous temple in Kyoto, with the beautiful stone garden. So when I went to visit them, I got to go check out Ryoanji. And the thing to do at Ryoanji is get there when it opens at 8 in the morning. It's too crowded later. Well, I guess depending on the day. So I've gotten way off with tangents here. Morinaga was one of 3 Dharma heirs of Goto. And, it was him and Walter Nowick, the other being Gary Snyder's teacher, Oda Sesso. And Morinaga said that Nowick was the first Westerner to complete Zen training in Japan. And Brian Victoria got Soto Zen Dharma transmission back then at some point. Anyway, here, now, I'm driving Suzuki, and he says, we're going to be ordaining you guys and sending you out around the country. You're going to be starting groups all over. And he said, you'll go to Texas. And I go, I'm not going to Texas. It was terrible. I was not very obedient to some. I said, I'm not going to Texas. I'm not going to do that. Or something like that. That's not a nice thing for me. I shouldn't be discouraging him. But I said there I felt completely unworthy and couldn't imagine I would ever be qualified to do that. Come on. I didn't want to go to Texas. So I've added that now. I mean, it's true, I didn't feel qualified to do that. But if he'd said something that I liked the idea of, I would have said, right. But I wanted to be with him and be his student. So, I didn't realize he was going to die in a year or two, whenever that was. So I didn't want to go anywhere. Right now, I'll tell you, I really like the Austin Zen Center. The Houston Zen Center is neat. Ruben Abito has a great group in Dallas. I've sat with people in Fort Worth, little tiny sitting groups. And with friends of mine that I knew when I was young there. But Austin group is the one I'm closest with. They're really neat. I did a Zoom with them. That was neat. Now here's a statement in the book that's just wrong that I had to rewrite. It says, so anyway, when Kobun arrived, so Richard Baker, he really doesn't like the way everybody's sucking up to Kobun and just, being so super respectful of him and everything, And at some point, and I say this, he says, there's people here that have studied longer than him, and I don't think that's true. Kobun was ordained when he was 12 years old, and he was born in 1938. He grew up at a temple, all right? From 1938, he was in a temple, and there is nothing more important in being successful in your career than growing up around it. That's, I can see that. And Michael Phillips, who has written a number of business books. He wrote The 7 Laws of Money, old friend of Zen Centers and mine, creator of MasterCard. He told me that. He said, that's number one. If you grow up around it, you're ahead of everybody. It doesn't matter if business school or any of that stuff. So, all right. So he grew up around it. He was at AHG for years. He was ordained in 1950. No, boy, I just took that out. I said, what was I thinking about? Now I changed it to, it irritated Richard when, as soon as Kobun arrived, Suzuki's students treated him with such immense respect, much more than afforded to Suzuki's senior students. However, I do remember Richard saying that there were people there that had more. But, that's the way we talk. We're inexact a lot. Then when you say, well, do you really think it's more? Well, all right. Then back up. We all do that. Well, to differing amounts depending on the person. Some people are very exacting and very careful what they say. So I shouldn't lump them in with that. And then others, we have quite an example now, very prominent in the news, of somebody who's so far on the other side is completely disconnected with reality, stuff they're saying. And they have the bully pulpit and are followed and believed by tens of millions. Well, that happens in history. Usually doesn't end well. Frequently bringing down a whole bunch of people with it. But we'll see. So anyway, then it talks about when I had that exchange with Suzuki, I said, well, did you ever have, because I would grill him about this transmission thing. And I thought it was very important to get from him saying, where he's talking about, and he's going to give all these people transmission. Well, does that mean they're perfectly enlightened? And no. It doesn't mean. It means, good understanding, a full commitment. We just had such idealized ideas of Buddhism and practice that we got from reading. So anyway, I talked to him, well, did you ever have a student who completely understood your practice? Yes. Were they American? No. Were they Japanese? Yes. Were they alive? No. And that ended there. And I've always wondered if that was Nishi Nakama. If you remember, he was the brilliant young man who was so active in Suzuki's salon, but not necessarily. Nishi Nakama had great social and communication skills, and also he had a powerful family that allowed him to ride the edge of the envelope more than most people. I think Nishi Nakama killed himself. Yeah, sad. I'll tell you, that's the person that just curious. I wish I'd learned more about him. I always wanted to. He just sounded so interesting. And those guys that studied with Suzuki that were peers of his, they all talked about him with, great respect. But I only had so much time and so much energy. So, what I learned is enough. And I can just have an idea about him that might approximate what he was like. And, that's it. No time for more. Then I run through all the people who'd been ordained. I'm cutting some of that out. Richard's ordination in 1967 to the fall of 1970, Suzuki had ordained 9 students as priests. I left out Reb Anderson. No, I didn't leave out Reb Anderson in that list. I left him out in the next list of who'd be in line to be Shuso. But anyway, I cut some of that out. Also, I had the wrong years for Ron Browning and Joyce. I said a young couple, Ron and Joyce Browning, were ordained in 1970 before they went to Japan to go into monasteries. They were ordained in 1968, so I've changed that. Can you believe all these little things I find like that? And Ron got heavily, and when he came back, he got heavily into Est, and then into Vipassana, into Theravadan Buddhism, and he still is. And he's brought teachers over. And Monea, my friend, if you've followed some of my first Life in Bali podcast that was freestanding, my first 2, Monea was the guest. He's an American Theravadan monk who lives here in Bali. He's just getting ready. He's 74. He's just getting ready to go off to a monastery or a retreat of some sort in Java for a few months. So Monea lived in Ron's compound for some time. I don't know how many years ago. Not that long ago. Maybe 7 years ago. Maybe when I was around. Yeah, when I was around there. And it talked about how the 6 original priests ordained before Richard were gone or on the periphery. And it mentions how, Claude was around Zen Center, but he really didn't like the way it had gotten so big. And he felt, even more so in later years, you can read quite a bit on him on Cuke.com. He felt that Suzuki reneged on, everything had been small and intimate in those early years, and Claude liked it that way. And he felt it got too hierarchical and too organized and too big. But he wanted it to be like the East-West house, which he sort of managed informally. And, that just couldn't be. I mean, did he not want Suzuki to have more disciples? I didn't, I was close with Claude, but I didn't sympathize with that. And then it said by the summer of 1976, priests had been head monks. And I left out Reb Anderson. But what I did this time is, rather than list the ones who would follow, I listed the ones who'd been chief priest up to that time in the book. Richard Baker, Philip Wilson, Claude Dallenberg, Gene Ross, Silas Hoadley, and Mel Weitzman. And then I just said the others would follow in order of seniority when possible. Like Bill Kwong couldn't, had to be a little later than he would have been normally, just because, you know, he had a job and he had 4 sons and a family, but he wasn't that out of it. He was the Shuso in 1971. One thing about seniority, like traditionally in Buddhism, seniorities, the day you arrive at the temple and are ordained, you know, you'd be ordained as soon as you arrive. Not like here, not like in America. I always say here for America when I'm on the other side of the world. But Suzuki did not consider seniority that way. For him, seniority was like when you arrived at the Zen Center before you were ordained. To him, seniority was the same, priest or lay. So when Mel Weitzman was ordained, and he needed to ordain Mel because he was going to be taking care of the Berkeley Zendo, and he just thought that would be better. But he told him, hey, Bill Kwong hasn't been ordained yet. He's senior to you. He'll always be senior to you. And it also says Ed Brown and I would follow. Why did I not mention Lou Richmond and Angie Brennan, who were ordained with us? I mean, it's sort of thoughtless oversight. So anyway, I took all that out. I didn't need to say all that stuff. Then it talks about, well, what should you call the new priest? And I've mentioned this before in other podcasts, but, you know, somebody gets ordained a priest at Zen Center, and that's what we call them, a priest. But, you know, in Japan, I think maybe we should have used the word unsui, just the Japanese. And I don't like using Japanese terms instead of English, but there is no comfortable term. And unsui is such a nice word. It means cloud water. And an unsui is a new monk. It's like a novice. But novice is a little, I don't know, it sort of has a pejorative sense. Unsui has a really, it's a nice word. I don't know what to say. Unsui sounds good. Novice sounds sort of a little ungood. And then finally, there was a lay ordination in August of 1970, and I got a lay ordination then, and I got a nice little rock, so I have it here, with it. Suzuki Roshi made it all out. That was wonderful. And that's the first one he did since 62, with some individual exceptions. I'm not really clear on all that. God, and look at this. Oksan just begging Suzuki to go with her on this pottery tour of Kyushu. You know, and she really asked for it, and then he gets sick. You know, and then, being a good Japanese wife, he's sick the whole time they're down there, and he's just staying in the hotel room. And so the first week she goes out and she comes back. Second week, she stays with him to take care of him and skips it. I mean, the way they sacrifice for each other, sometimes out of a sense of duty. She could have left him those days too. But she asked for him. Why'd she have to insist he come? She would have been all free and everything without him. She didn't need him. Anyway, pardon me. And then Richards talks about how he wanted to leave Eiheiji, and Suzuki wanted him to stay to the end, and Graham said no, he should stay to the end. It doesn't mention what my understanding of what happened is that Suzuki went down there to visit him, and he said, I'm leaving with you. And Suzuki just went to visit his disciple at Eiheiji. But, you know, Dick just couldn't stand it. And, you know, he wasn't, some people just went with it, you know, like Philip and Jean and Graham. Graham had a very hard time. Philip and Jean had a better time. But Graham stuck with it, but he spent a lot of time he says in the hospital, but mainly it was in a doctor's house near there. But, you just wonder, there's nothing for me to learn here. I don't care. He doesn't care about that crap. I'm leaving with you. He said, no, you have to stay. No, I'm leaving with you, And he was just adamant. So Suzuki was very embarrassed and took him with him. I remember Reb told me once I should go to Eiheiji and, do it. There should be somebody from Zen Center in these modern times that does it. And I had absolutely no interest. Right now, I've been there since then a couple of times. And the last time with Katrinka was wonderful. They were so nice to us. And I thought, I could see, I wouldn't, it's way out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing. I mean, it's a small town. There's nothing happening out there. So the only thing, I could see, staying somewhere and sitting there and having some relationship, because they were all friendly as heck with me. They had nothing like when I was there before, and had my new book Sin right here in Japanese, and we're showing it to each other, and it was introduced to the head cook, the Tenzo, and it was really nice. So I thought, and I know Taigen has stayed there. You just stay and just do what they're doing, You just in Rome, do what they do. But there is. I mean, they have so much ceremony, and you'd end up having to sit seiza a long time. I don't know. That would be dangerous for me now. No, I couldn't do it. Anyway, Richard also told me this whole thing about he's at Rinso In with Suzuki, and he said he totally ignored me. I'm sitting in the back room there, copying these kanji over, which doesn't mean shit. And although he probably wouldn't have said it that way. And he said, finally, I just stormed into where he was and say, hey, spend time with me or I'm leaving. Look at that relationship. You can see it over and over. And Suzuki did it. No Japanese ever would have done it, and very few Westerner, maybe no other Westerner would have, no other student of Suzuki's would have done it. Anyway, I think it's interesting. It says in Kyoto, Richard practiced a year at Antaiji and then sat at Daitokuji. But I didn't say who with, so I added that. In Kyoto, Richard practiced a year at Antaiji with Abbot Kosho Uchiyama, then sat at Daitokuji with Nanrei Sohaku Kobori, a Rinzai teacher. It was neat. Suzuki asked Graham, he said, I can't find any good place. What do you suggest? He said, well, you have to go to Antaiji, where Uchiyama was. Now, I think it's very significant here, where it said, and I didn't say where I got this. It's when Suzuki went to Antaiji and he met with Japanese students of Uchiyama and he talked to them. And then in the evening, he met with English-speaking students, talked to them, and some of the ones who'd been at the Japanese talk came to the evening talk, and it said only then did they realize why he was so successful in American, why he had so many students. They said when they heard him in Japanese, it just bored them. And that was told to me by Tom Wright, who was Uchiyama's disciple and translator, and I have an interview with him on Cook.com. Well, so much comes to mind when I go through the chapter, and then when I do these comments on it, and I experience a lot. I experience it somewhat sometimes like putting together the pieces of a puzzle, and it's missing a lot of the pieces, and a lot of the pieces are back there in the past. gets harder and harder to get them. Quite unlikely to get a lot of but there are enough to get a general picture. But it's hard not for somebody putting it together not to want to fill in every little piece. But it doesn't really matter how many pieces are missing, because it's the spirit of the puzzle that matters, not the picture it makes. The picture's like a fascinating dance that is projected in the spirit like clouds floating by. This has been a Cuke Audio podcast. I'm DC, Poobah of Cuke Audio and Cuke Archives, coming to you from Sleepy Sanur with Dogette Bandita, Feline Cuchita, and dear lovely Katrinka. Wishing you, and yours, and all of us, a grand awakening.